What are you doing right now? Whether you are running, cooking, or just sitting on the couch while you're watching this, your body is actively using energy, just maybe a different amount of it. From pumping blood through your arteries and veins to moving along the contents of your intestines to just keeping themselves alive. Every cell in your body is using some amount of fuel to maintain itself and perform its functions. So, what is this cellular power and where does it come from? Welcome back to the science scene. My name is Shelby Bradford and I'm the Geeky Goth. We're here to explore all things cells, and today that's hitting the highlights of cell metabolism and energy. Metabolism is the collection of chemical reactions that our cells perform to keep themselves alive and perform their functions. One very important metabolic activity is the process of making energy. Before we get to work ourselves on breaking down this topic, a disclaimer. This subject is complicated. I love a good deep dive, but the reality is that there are entire college courses, careers dedicated to this stuff. So while I hope to impart a thorough appreciation of the wonders of how our cells create the energy that powers everything we do, just remember, there's always more to learn. So, without further ado, let's jump in by starting at the end. When we talk about energy for cells, we're really interested in harnessing the energy that exists between atomic bonds. Our cells do that through a complex process of breaking these original bonds in the molecules from food, which themselves aren't very useful to our cells, and reorganizing them into bonds on compounds that are more easily used by our cell machinery to do its tasks. This energy storing molecule is a chemical group called a phosphate. This phosphorus atom bound to 4 oxygen atoms is chock full of high energy bonds. However, these chemical substrates aren't stable enough to float around on their own. Instead, cells attach 3 phosphates onto a chemical called adenosine to create the energy-packed adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. What makes ATP so useful is that it's loaded with energy in these chemical bonds. But because of all the oxygen atoms repelling each other in the phosphates, this molecule is very willing to let one of those groups go. When a reaction requires energy, ATP provides this resource by breaking the bond between 2 of these phosphates, releasing one. The released phosphate binds to the protein or other compound and transfers that energy from the broken bond to the new molecule, allowing the reaction to occur. However, sometimes a single phosphate group is only able to be used for one action, sometimes literally taking one step or placing one compound into place. That means to get anything done, our cells need a constant stream of phosphate groups and therefore ATP. Now that we know what our cells use to do work, let's see how they produce that resource. It starts with what we eat. There are mechanisms for our cells to get energy from proteins and lipids, but for this video, we're just going to look at the fuel that drives the majority of cellular metabolism. Good old glucose, a lovable carbohydrate. The process of turning this sugar into usable energy occurs in 4 distinct parts: glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Glycolysis alone involves 10 individual steps and just as many enzymes and intermediates. I am not going to go through them, but you can see them all here and take a screenshot if you like. In my honest opinion, though, only a masochist would choose to memorize all of that. No offense to the biochemists. Instead, let's understand what each of these parts is for and the key outcomes of each of them. Starting with glycolysis. This series of chemical reactions can occur completely without oxygen. Glycolysis is also an important process for other cell functions because there are multiple points at which some of the products can be shunted toward other paths, such as to make nucleic acids and lipids. Additionally, this process is very in tune, so to speak, with the needs of the cell. It can be sped up or slowed down by the enzyme in the third step of the pathway, and if need be, glycolysis can even run in reverse to store sugar in a more long-term form. But we'll cover that another time. Today, let's make some energy. Turning glucose into cellular fuel does use a little bit of ATP, 2 molecules for each piece of glucose. Additionally, one of these steps requires shuffling some electrons around. Cells use a molecule called NAD for this little dance, which picks up these electrons by binding a hydrogen atom to become NADH. Each molecule of glucose makes 2 NADH. Besides NADH, by the end of the 10th step, glycolysis produces a total of 4 molecules of ATP. So the net gain is 2 ATP for each molecule of glucose. Additionally, glycolysis produces 2 molecules of a chemical called pyruvate. Now, this doesn't sound very impressive, but since this process occurs without any oxygen, it can be really helpful in times when we may not have a lot of that available. For example, during strenuous exercise, our muscles use just glycolysis for energy because it's faster. Additionally, red blood cells can only use glycolysis because they don't have the machinery for the subsequent steps. In these examples, the pyruvate is converted into lactate or lactic acid, and in the process, that NADH turns back into NAD so that glycolysis can keep going. This is called fermentation. However, for normal function, our cells want that big ATP payoff for the glucose they use. In that case, pyruvate is instead pushed into the center of the mitochondria to undergo pyruvate oxidation. We'll keep it short and just say that each molecule is converted into a chemical called acetyl coenzyme A. This process also generates another molecule of NADH and some carbon dioxide. We'll come back to the NADH, but acetyl coenzyme A is going to drive the citric acid cycle. Much like glycolysis, there are lots of paths into and out of this series of reactions to access other macromolecular building blocks, but we're going to keep moving on our energy pipeline. At the end of this cycle, we've regenerated acetyl coenzyme A, hence calling it a cycle, and also produced another molecule of ATP, carbon dioxide, NADH, and a similar electron carrier called FADH2 for every acetyl coenzyme A that went into the cycle. We're almost at the end as we come to the inner membrane of the mitochondria, where there are 4 protein complexes that separate the hydrogens from all of the NADH and FADH2 that's been generated and force these atoms into the inner membrane space of this organelle. This regenerates NAD and FADH to be used in glycolysis and the citric acid cycle. Meanwhile, the electrons released from breaking these bonds are passed down these 4 proteins until we're ready to deal with them. In the meantime, those hydrogen atoms that got pumped into the inner membrane space desperately want to exit and become reunited with an electron. Luckily, the final step in this electron transport chain is ATP synthase, a crank-like protein that allows the hydrogen to flow back into the mitochondrial space. However, when they do so, they turn this crank, which is holding a molecule of ADP, in close proximity to a phosphate group, as the hydrogen flow through, they rotate ATP synthase, and these two substrates are pushed so close together that they bond and ATP is formed. This is also where the oxygen that we said we needed comes in. It reacts with the returned hydrogen and spare electrons to form water before these negative charges can wreak havoc on the rest of the cell. There's some variability, but when this oxidative phosphorylation step is included, the whole four-part process is estimated to produce 30 to 32 molecules of ATP per unit of glucose. That's a payoff. And that's the core of cellular energy. When you think about it, it's an awful lot of work to just turn a crank and make some water and carbon dioxide. But you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, while that is probably the most famous example of metabolism, we've got a lot more cellular processes to check out. So if you want to dive into more science shenanigans, hit that like and follow button, and I'll see you next time.